If the first half of Pablo Escobar's life was a study in brilliant, cold industrialization of crime, the logistics, the airplanes, the sheer volume of cash rotting in basements, the second half is a descent into a specific kind of madness that history rarely witnesses. It is the transition from a criminal CEO into a warlord. By the mid-1980s, the equation had drastically changed. The silver or lead dynamic that allowed him to bribe his way to the top of Colombia was failing. The state, heavily pressured by the United States, was no longer willing to take the silver. They were preparing for the ultimate weapon against the cartels: extradition. To understand the psychology of Pablo Escobar in this period, you have to understand his absolute primal terror of the American judicial system. He famously declared, "Better a grave in Colombia than a cell in the United States." He knew that in a Colombian prison, he was still the patron. He could buy guards, he could order lobster, he could run his empire. In an American federal supermax, he was just a number, cut off from the money and his power. To prevent this, Escobar didn't just hire better lawyers. He declared war on the concept of the nation-state itself. He invented a new form of political violence: narco-terrorism. This wasn't terrorism for ideology or religion. This was terrorism as a brutal corporate negotiating tactic. This is part 2 of the Pablo Escobar saga, the Plomo and the Plata.
To force the government to abandon the extradition treaty, Escobar formed a shadow organization called the Extraditables. They published manifestos in newspapers, framing themselves as Colombian patriots fighting against American imperialism. But their actions were pure slaughter. They began a systematic campaign to decapitate the Colombian state. Assassinations became a daily occurrence. They gunned down the Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Lara Bunella, in his limousine. They assassinated the leading reformist presidential candidate, Luis Carlos Guillén, on stage in front of thousands of people. But Escobar realized that targeting specific politicians wasn't breaking the government fast enough. He needed the average citizen to be so terrified, so exhausted by the bloodshed, that they would beg the government to surrender to the cartels just to make the bombing stop. So he turned Medellin and Bogota into war zones. He planted massive car bombs in shopping malls on Mother's Day. He detonated a truck bomb packed with 500 kilograms of dynamite directly in front of the DEAS building, the Colombian equivalent of the FBI, shattering windows for 20 blocks. The psychological toll was absolute. Escobar placed a financial bounty on the head of every police officer in Medellin. He paid his young sicarios roughly $2,000 for every cop they killed. Teenage hitmen on motorcycles would shoot traffic cops at intersections just to collect the fee. The social contract completely evaporated.
2 specific events define the era of absolute brutality and show just how far Escobar was willing to go. The first is the Palace of Justice siege in November 1985. This stands as one of the most cynical, devastating alliances in criminal history. A heavily armed leftist guerrilla group, M19, stormed the Supreme Court building in Bogota, taking hundreds of hostages, including the entire Supreme Court bench. The army responded with overwhelming force, driving tanks through the front doors. In the ensuing firestorm, the building burned to the ground, and over 100 people died, including 11 Supreme Court justices. For years, this was viewed simply as a tragic guerrilla attack, but intelligence later strongly linked the cartel to the funding of the operation. Why would a hyper-capitalist billionaire fund a communist militia? Because the Supreme Court was currently reviewing the constitutionality of the extradition treaty with the U.S. The court building held the physical files on the extraditables. When M19 stormed the building, one of their primary actions was to burn the records room. The files were reduced to ash. The judges were dead. the extradition issue was effectively paused. It was a masterstroke of Machiavellian violence, using revolutionaries as a proxy to destroy paperwork.
The second event marked the moment Escobar lost any lingering claim to being the Robin Hood of the people. The bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in November 1989. Escobar's intelligence network informed him that Cesar Gaviria, the presidential candidate who strongly supported extradition, would be on a commercial flight from Bogota to Cali. Escobar didn't send a hitman with a gun. He sent a bomb. A young, naive recruit was given a briefcase and told he was carrying a recording device to tape some conversations on the plane. He was told to flip a switch when the plane reached altitude. The briefcase actually contained a bomb placed perfectly over the central fuel tanks. 5 minutes after takeoff, the device detonated. The explosion ignited the fuel vapors, blowing the plane out of the fucking sky. 107 people on board were vaporized, made into nothing. But the horrifying punchline of the tragedy was this. Cesar Gaviria, he wasn't on the plane. His security chief, sensing a trap, had advised him not to fly at the last minute. Escobar had murdered 107 innocent civilians, mothers, businessmen, children, to target a man who was sitting safely in his office. This atrocity fundamentally turned the tide of public opinion. Escobar was no longer a rebel fighting the elite. He was a monster, indiscriminately killing the innocent.
Despite the public outrage, the sheer volume of violence eventually broke the political will of the Colombian government. In 1991, they capitulated, cutting a deal with Escobar that reads like magical realism. The government agreed to ban the extradition of Colombian citizens. In exchange, Escobar agreed to surrender and serve 5 years in prison. But the catch was absurd. He was allowed to build his own prison. The facility was La Catedral, the cathedral. Located on a foggy mountainside in Envigado, overlooking Medellin, it was a fortress resort. Escobar chose the site specifically because the steep topography prevented surprise military assaults, and the fog obscured visibility from aircraft. It had a natural waterfall, a disco, and an industrial kitchen. Most importantly, the cathedral was equipped with a state-of-the-art communication center. Through faxes, cellular phones, and two-way radios, Escobar continued to run the Medellin cartel from inside his own prison. The facility became known as the Office of Envigado. The state had essentially given him a heavily fortified, legally protected bunker from which to run his global drug empire.
The La Catedral arrangement collapsed in 1992, not because of government intervention, but because of Escobar's own escalating paranoia. Inside the prison, he began to suspect that his top lieutenants on the outside, Moncada and Galeano, were stealing money from him while he was locked up. Escobar summoned the two men to La Catedral for a meeting. Once inside the walls, they were subjected to a gruesome interrogation. They were tortured, murdered, and their bodies were dismembered and incinerated on the prison grounds. When the Colombian government discovered that that prisoner was running a torture chamber and disappearing high-ranking cartel members inside a government-sanctioned facility, the humiliation was absolute. President Gaviria ordered the military to seize the prison and transfer Escobar to a real military base. But Escobar had designed the facility. He knew the escape routes. When the special forces surrounded La Catedral in July 1992, the lights mysteriously went out. Using the dense mountain fogs as cover, Escobar and his entourage simply walked out of the back gate, slipping through a pre-weakened section of the fence, and vanished into the forest. the king of cocaine was loose again, triggering the final 16-month manhunt.
The final manhunt revolutionized the tactics of the drug war. The Colombian government formed the Search Bloc, an elite unit of police trained by U.S. Delta Force. But more importantly, the United States deployed CentraSpike, a top-secret Joint Special Operations Command unit specializing in signal intelligence. CentraSpike brought technology previously reserved for hunting Soviet submarines. They flew Beechcraft planes high over Medellin, equipped with devices that intercepted radio and cellular phone devices. They used radio direction finding to hunt a specific voice print, Pablo Escobar's. Escobar knew they were listening. He kept his calls under 2 minutes, the time it took to get a fix, but CentraSpike was relentless, constantly triangulating his location and passing the coordinates to the search block for sledgehammer raids. Simultaneously, a far darker force entered the war, Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. This was a shadowy vigilante death squad, funded by the rival Cali Cartel, and fed intelligence by corrupt elements of the national police. Los Pepes didn't play by the rules of law enforcement. They waged a scorched earth campaign. They didn't hunt Escobar, they hunted his infrastructure. They assassinated his lawyers, murdered his bankers, and burned down his family members' homes. They systematically dismantled the network that kept Escobar safe. The man who had terrorized the nation was finally being terrorized himself.
The end came on December 2nd, 1993, the day after Escobar's 44th birthday. Isolated, running out of cash, and stripped of his allies by Los Pepes, he was hiding in a middle-class row house in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellin. He made a fatal mistake, driven by loneliness. He stayed on the phone with his son, Juan Pablo, for too long. CentraSpike caught the signal. The RDF needles crossed. They triangulated the exact block, and the search block zeroed in on a specific house. Heavily armed troops stormed the front door. Escobar, barefoot and bearded, grabbed a Glock pistol and climbed out of the back window onto the terracotta roof, attempting to escape into the alleyway. A fierce firefight erupted. He was hit in the leg and the torso, knocking him down onto the tiles. Then a fatal shot entered his right ear, killing him instantly. The image of his death remains iconic and polarizing. The bloated body of the most powerful criminal in history, lying shoeless on a dirty roof, surrounded by smiling Colombian police officers, posing with his corpse like a big game trophy. The ballistic evidence of the final shot to the ear remains contested. Some claim it was a police sniper. Others, including his family, insist he committed suicide to avoid capture, fulfilling his promise of choosing a grave in Colombia over a cell in the U.S. Regardless of who pulled the final trigger, the era of the narcocratic state has ended.
We've reached the end of the show, and before we sign off, it's time for final thoughts. When you trace the complete arc of Pablo Escobar's life, from the brilliant logistics of the air bridge to his bloody barefoot death on a terracotta roof, it serves as the ultimate case study in the absolute limits of power. Escobar fundamentally believed that money could buy anything. And for a long time, he was right. It bought him police forces, it bought him politicians, it bought him an island in the Bahamas, and it even bought him a custom-built prison. He amassed a fortune so incomprehensibly large that he literally had to bury it in the dirt because the global banking system couldn't hold it. But what Escobar failed to realize until it was far too late is that while money can buy compliance and terror can buy silence, neither of them can buy legitimacy. When he shifted from being a criminal industrialist to a narco-terrorist, when he started blowing up airplanes and burning down Supreme Courts, he crossed an invisible threshold. He invited a level of state and international retaliation that no amount of buried billions could withstand. He built an empire on the premise that he was untouchable. He used the poor as human shields and the government as a personal punching bag. But in the end, the very technology he used to build his empire, the communication networks, the cellular phones, was exactly what the government used to hunt him down. The death of Pablo Escobar did not stop the flow of cocaine. The Cali cartel simply stepped in and ran it quieter and more efficiently. But it did permanently end the delusion that a single criminal could wage an open symmetrical war against a sovereign nation and survive. He built a fortress, but he died running. Take care of yourselves and each other, and we'll see you next time.